Hi, my name is Timothy Gager, and welcome to Virtual Fridays, Dire Literary Series. And tonight, my guest is the acclaimed and wonderful Jim Shepard. And let me tell you a little bit of something about Jim. And this is straight from the source at Penguin Random. So and there it is. Jim Shepard is the author of 7 previous novels. His most recent, The Book of Aaron, and it's not his most recent.
Nope.
In fact, it's his second most recent novel. But anyway, they listed here though, Phase 6.
There you go.
Recent. And the Book of Aaron was the winner of the 2016 Penn New England Award. And if I've got to read Jim Shepard's bio, Jim is so well known as an excellent writer and source, and Phase 6 is such a wonderful book. And so how about, instead of me talking anymore, we just turn it right over to Jim Shepard. So Jim, take it away.
All right. I was going to read the beginning of a new story. Would you like me to read the Phase 6 instead, Tim?
Whatever you would like to do is fine with me.
All right. This is a new story called The Mentally Ill Are Not Alone. It has subheadings, so I'll read the subheadings as well. And I'll just read about the first 4 pages and then stop in order to maximize your disappointment. And then we can do the Q&A. Story goes like this. It's called The Mentally Ill Are Not Alone. First subheading, a new concept in treating the mentally ill. In 1968, the designation T1 meant no more to us shepherds than any other combination of letters and numbers. But by 69, just saying it would stop a happy moment in its tracks and make all miserable ones worse. There are a lot of miserable ones. As far as my parents were concerned, my brother, by then, had progressed from barely manageable to entirely unmanageable. A transformation so agonizing for them that they'd gone from being unable to talk about it with their closest friends and relatives to throwing up their hands and shouting at their youngest son, me, I don't know what to do with him. Do you? You tell me. I didn't have any recommendations. John was 5 years older, and with the exception of a few sunny windows of calm, had been intractably anguished since I'd been sentient. And even before that, if the dispiriting photos of him in our 2 or 3 family albums were any indication. From the earliest age, he'd been mortified by his appearance, though he'd always looked more presentable than me, and had tried to forbid photographs, even on big occasions. And the result had been any Christmas, 3 or 4 shots of me with either parent in front of the tree and one of him, with an expression that made a friend of mine once ask, what happened that day? By 1969, John had dropped out of high school. He had lost or quit 3 jobs. We'd had our first 2 incidents involving the police, which was how my father referred to them. Can you imagine this? We had to call the frickin' cops, was my mother's humiliated and enraged version to siblings on the phone. He'd tried group counseling. He'd tried family counseling. He'd had individual sessions with a psychologist that had gone so badly that the psychologist had told my parents after their final meeting, John doesn't seem to want to get better. He was 16 years old. My mother routinely threatened him when he was at his most abusive, with Newtown, the site of the state mental hospital. But even I knew that both of my parents were maximally horrified, not only by the stigma of such a place, but with the impossibility of getting a life back once you'd been there. My father asked around at work, and I can only imagine what it cost him to do that, and presented my mother one night when they thought the kids were asleep with what he'd come up with, a private place, and one that would take John in for only a limited amount of time, a facility at Yale, New Haven. My father had only finished high school and my mother 6th grade, so I could hear, even sitting there on the stairs in the dark and unable to see them, how much the name Yale quieted them, the way it might suggest the best of care. The next day after school, I found what he'd called some of the literature on it in his dresser, a pamphlet headed T1, a new concept in treating the mentally ill. dog on a chain. It might have been private and it might have been a limited amount of time, but it was still institutionalization. And that felt like such a cliff to walk off that even given our situation, at first, my parents just couldn't do it. Things were quiet much of the time, after all. He kept to himself. He played his records, every so often wandered into the kitchen to make tea or into the den to see what we were watching. So you could tell yourself for stretches that maybe we'd turn to Connor. Maybe the ceasefire would hold. Just about anything could set him off, though. And three things almost always did. Bad news on the TV about the war or politics. My mother talking on the phone about him, or me refusing to back down when he tried to off-vent a little of his rage in my direction, rather than always at our parents. The problem with trying to manage those three, if you were my father, was that it was 1969, so the news on the TV about the war or politics was almost always bad. My mother was almost always on the phone, always in grievance mode, and my brother was her main subject. And her idea of keeping her voice down meant that only the closest neighbors could hear. And finally, while it seemed to me that I spent my whole life turning the other cheek, while my brother shouted into my face, my parents couldn't help but note that in fact, every sixth or seventh time my mode was in fact to scream back at him. On one of those occasions, maybe 3 weeks after my father had brought home the T1 pamphlet, my brother was nose to nose with me, screaming at me for having touched one of his albums and jabbing his finger into my cheek. He was spectacularly good when enraged at invading your space in the most unnerving ways, while listing at high volume and with unsettling accuracy all of my shortcomings. When I snapped and pursued him up the stairs, trying to give as good as I got, I was shiftless. I was a parasite. It moved him into a whole new realm of homicidal anger. And my father's mediation attempts consisted of trying to wedge himself between us on the stairs and shouting for my brother to go to his room. My brother headed that way, finally, yelling to no one in particular about the unfairness of my protected status. And once my father headed back downstairs, I kicked my brother's door open, hitting him in the face as he was coming over to make sure it was shut. I'm 60 whatever years old, and to this day, I don't think I've ever seen a face transform like his did at that moment. He lifted me off my feet and over his head, the WWE spectacle before there was a WWE, and threw me down the stairs. My head hit the ceiling, and I caught the banister with my hands on the way down, but otherwise hit the roll-top desk at the bottom with enough brio to knock the molding off the top. My father found me on my head and shoulders with my feet still in the air and went up after him. By the time he came back down, my brother was still shouting, mostly to himself. And after reassuring himself that nothing was broken, my father had to shout at me to make himself heard. What is the matter with you? He wanted to know. It was a question I asked myself all the time. How hard is this to remember? He shouted. He's a mad dog on a chain. You don't stick your fingers in his mouth. The mentally ill are not alone. And so there we were in a Greek diner in New Haven, a city we almost never visited, though it was only 20 minutes from Bridgeport. We were supposed to be getting lunch before the appointment at the hospital. We weren't saying much, but from across the room, you could tell that everyone at our table was having the worst day of his or her life. My father went to pay the check and just stood at the counter. My mother went to see what he was doing. My brother looked over the ruins of what I was eating and waited. He hadn't ordered. And when my mother had said, "But you'll be hungry later," his expression in response had made us all look away. The doctor who said he was the head of the ward walked us through everything in a little room off the waiting room. T stood for Tompkins, the building we were in. And the innovative key to the treatment here was the maintenance of close relations between the patient, his family, and other members of the community. As much treatment time as possible would consist of discussions with the family and patient together. And all of the patients were adolescents or young adults. all of which help the patient understand that the mentally ill are not alone. He asked my age and said that 11 was plenty old enough to be a part of the process. My father said he wasn't sure how often we could get ourselves up to New Haven, and time was spent working out a schedule. John didn't speak for the entire interaction, and even when asked questions. "That work for you, John?" the doctor finally said, and when he didn't get any response, my father said, "Answer the doctor." And when John just looked at both of them, teary and defiant, the doctor finally conceded, "I guess that's our answer." We were given a minute to absorb what we've been told and to raise any concerns. None of us spoke up. The doctor added that in his experience, families were delighted to visit and to maintain contact with not only the patients, but also the doctors and the med students always circulating. John was shown his bed. There were 4 rooms, each with 6 little sleeping and sitting areas. We stood around before we said our goodbyes. And on our way out, his voice broke, and he pleaded with us not to leave him there. He followed us to the door, his hand on my sleeve, dragging me back towards him. And I remember being petrified by the shock of responsibility suggested by his having grabbed me. Did I have the power to call this off? If I did, I didn't exercise it. None of us could look at each other all the way down in the elevator. I couldn't see the back seat the whole drive home. My mother spent the night crying her way from room to room, rearranging things. My father kept widening his eyes and blinking while he tried to make me an egg the next morning before school. He said my mother was sleeping in. And when the nun in my 5th grade class asked what was wrong, I told her what I'd already heard my father telling people, that we were experiencing some difficulties in my house, but that we weren't ready to give up just yet, because we were still working some things through. I think I'll stop there.
Wow. Can I ask you how much more it has to go? So I'm willing to sacrifice my extremely insightful questions to hear the rest of it.
It's about 18 pages, so you don't have enough time to hear the rest of it, unfortunately. It's a longer story.
And it's so refreshing to hear a longer story in such, the old school form. I mean, I grew up with all of the great short story masters in the 60s and reading them. Were those influences of yours as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I came to fiction very late because I was the first member of my family to go to college. And my dad filled the house with books, but because he hadn't gone to college, he thought, well, if you're going to read, you should learn something. So the books were all nonfiction. So I really only started reading fiction when it was assigned to me in school and then in college. And I came to the great short story writers pretty late for that reason. I came to Salinger early because a relative gave me some Salinger. And I found people like Hemingway and Flannery O'Connor on my own. But they were a huge influence. The idea that you hit the ground running and that you don't waste any time, and that you get right to the heart of the matter, that had enormous appeal to me.
So when you moved to fiction as a reader, who was the very first story or author that you read that you said, wow, I think I can do this. I want to do this?
Oh, I think I can do this, boy. I think every writer has that moment when you feel a little empowered, when you think, oh, is this acceptable? Can you do it like this? And I mentioned a relative giving me a Salinger collection. I had thought, because of my background, that people from a world like I came from didn't write literature. And so I thought you had to be Henry James to write literature. And I knew I wasn't Henry James. But what Salinger was revelatory about was not so much class, because he actually came from higher class than I did. But the idea that the quotidian, the everyday quotidian, could work as a subject that would be not only compelling, but important. And that was a revelation to me. So stories like Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut or Teddy or stories like that, I thought, wow, so you're allowed to do this? Cool. And I thought I could try a colloquial voice that I might be able to do. And so that opened a lot of doors for me, I think.
You had an experience like that with Larry Brown.
Yeah.
Wow, what great writing. Let's move to some other folks' questions. Robert has a question about Jewish literary markets, and he has said that he has poetry and fiction rejected by 2 Jewish literary magazines.
Mm-hmm.
Most themes the journals publish are being about Holocaust survival or child, grandchild of parent with cancer, no humor. Have you submitted to Jewish literary magazines? If yes, which? And what was your experience compared to mine?
I have not submitted to specifically Jewish literary markets. Although I have to say I haven't been tracking the ethnicities and religions of some of the markets I've been submitting to. So it's possible I didn't even know that. But I know what he means about, I know what Robert means about that sense of, well, if we're going to deal with Jewish literature, shouldn't we go right to the most important subject? And if we're going to do that, also, shouldn't you be somebody who has unimpeachable authority in that matter? Somebody who was there or whose relative was there or something like that. And of course, given that literature is supposed to be a work of the imagination, I resist that notion, but I do believe that you have a responsibility to subjects like that. And getting back to Robert's marketplace point, I think humor is always a little harder to sell, believe it or not. I think the assumption about humor is that it's a lighter piece, and therefore there's a little bit more suspicion of it. I know that George Saunders has said that he felt that held him back for a while, that he was too goofy for the market in some ways.
Well, your book of Aaron, obviously the protagonist is a child during the Holocaust, but the book you wrote before that, Paper Doll, also takes place during World War II. Did you get ideas for a book of Aaron while you were writing Paper Doll?
Oh, no. Paper Doll came out of my father's experience. He was a dorsal turret gunner. And I wanted to try and get at, I've always been fascinated by that situation where you have enormous responsibility and no ability. That feels like the way I go through life. And so, when my father would talk about dorsal turret training, it just seemed like, you get this half-assed training, then you're asked to do something close to impossible. You're stuck in a plane and everybody's life depends on it. And I just thought, wow, I want to write about that emotional position. It never occurred to me to write about the Holocaust until I often get, because I write about all sorts of weird shit, I get ex-students and friends will often write to me and say, hey, have you ever thought about writing this or that? And an ex-student wrote to me and said, why have you never written about Janusz Korczak? And I wrote him back and said, well, Korczak is one of those astonishing heroes of history that you wonder how you could even build a central conflict around him. It's like, how do you write a novel about Jesus or Gandhi? Or, so it's like, well, he's one of the great humans of all time, but he didn't do the dishes, or what is the conflict supposed to be? And so I thought, I don't see how you could do anything other than hagiography if you're writing about someone as amazing as Korczak. But I'm also one of those weirdos who has Korczak's Ghetto Diary in his house. And so I reread it. And I was just reading along, and I came across this story that I'd forgotten of a mother who was dying. And she said to Korczak, you got to take my 10-year-old into the orphanage. And he said, I don't have any room. And she said, well, then I won't die. And every month for 6 months, she had tuberculosis. Every month for 6 months, she said to him, do you have room for my son? And he said, no. And she goes, well, then I won't die. And then finally, after 6 months, he said, actually, a space has opened up. And she said, thank God. And she died. And the son never forgave Korczak. And I thought, what would that be like? What would it be like to be the child who can't appreciate the saint, who's so damaged that in fact he won't accept that he's in the presence of this amazing human being. What would it be like to see that amazing human being from that angle? And my mother would go, yeah, what would that be like? I wonder, to be the child who doesn't appreciate the saint, right? So I had ways into the story, and I started researching it, and I went to Poland and stuff like that. And I remember thinking, are you really going to do this? And a surprising number of my projects and stories result in me at some point or another going, are you really going to do this? And at some point after I finish it, my agent usually says something like, did you really just do that? What are you thinking, essentially?
Well, you were talking about your father's role, what he did in your book. So you believe there has to be some sort of truth or amount of truth in fiction. And if that's the case, with what you just read for us tonight, where's the truth in that?
Well, there's anything I write, I'm hoping there's emotional truth in it. I mean, I have a story narrated by the creature from the Black Lagoon who doesn't exist and never did. And I hope it had some emotional truth in it. Everything I write is autobiographical in some kind of emotional way. And in the case of the story tonight, a lot of it is autobiographical in historical terms and events. And in fact, there's a whole sort of subsection of my fiction that you might call the Bridgeport stories, many of which are by far the most autobiographical of my stories. And I find it a nice change from some of the very, very research heavy stories that I'm doing to sort of get back. It's sort of like getting back to your roots in some ways. It's like you're not doing any research for this. You're just sort of mining all your miserable memories, that kind of thing.
DeWitt has a question. Coleridge once defined wit in terms of fancy, more commonplace, and imagination, rare. I wonder if and how that distinction filters your judgment of your writing and reading.
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure Coleridge's dichotomy still holds up for me, but certainly I find myself always trying to do everything I can to enlarge my imagination and thereby enlarge my engagement with the world. And I think that's part of what Coleridge is getting at. So whether I'm trying to imagine myself into the Warsaw Ghetto, or whether I'm trying to imagine myself back into my childhood in Bridgeport, I'm keenly aware that I'm taking bits of memory and mixing them alchemically in a weird way with shit that I'm imagining, and almost all that I'm imagining I'm pulling in from other sources as well, right? What is our imagination if not this kind of weird grab bag of stuff we've experienced in various ways and then recombined, So that, in that sense, imagination is something I think very close to what Coleridge was thinking about.
I think you've already answered with that last answer the first half of this question about do you ever find yourself falling into a formula? Like, in other words, your creativity has, I'll just go here because I've gone to this formula before.
Yeah, Amy Hempel quotes Mark Richard, the short story writer, as quoting Tom Waits as saying, at one point Richard was watching Waits compose a song, and Richard said, so, how did you know what you wanted to do there in terms of chords? And Tom Waits said, your hands are like dogs. They just go to places that they're used to going to, and I think we all have moves that you can recognize. I know what an Amy Hempel move looks like. I know what a Ron Carlson move looks like. I know what an Amy Bender move looks like. And they know what my moves look like. And we're trying in some ways to not do the same thing over and over again. But we are aware that we have a limited toolbox, and we're also aware that we have a limited number of obsessions. We're trying to make ourselves more interesting human beings and more interesting craftsmen so that the toolbox can keep being expanded and so that the obsessions can keep being expanded. But we can all think of writers who you go, oh, that was great. That was just like the other thing. Right?
Have you used Amy Hempel's move at all?
I do some of Amy's, Amy has a great line where she goes, when she gets in trouble, she brings a dog into the story. I've certainly done that before. It's Amy's version of the old Raymond Chandler thing, when in doubt, have somebody enter a room with a gun. And I certainly have learned a lot from her ability to have a great sort of line and then just get the hell out of a scene. She's a little bit like the short story version of Monty Python. She's sort of like, you don't have to end the scene. Just when you're ready, get the hell out, move to the next scene.
I'm not dead yet. So let's talk a little bit about Phase 6. As Phase 6 came out in 2021, and it's very much, reminiscent of the 2020 year and the pandemic. So did you write all of it in 2020 and have it come out that quickly?
No, I've been writing it for 5 years, and I delivered it to Knopf in March of 2020. I delivered it, in other words, just as the pandemic was really hitting, and they, thank God, had bought it in advance. And so they were like, what the hell are we going to do with this? How do you sell a pandemic novel in the middle of a pandemic? And there was a big debate, since this had never happened before, as far as anybody knew. There was a big debate between let's get it out as soon as possible. I mean, oh my God, there's a pandemic raging. And no, we got to wait. You don't want it to seem like, it's a sensational thing ripped from today's headline. They went back and forth. I certainly didn't know what the answer was. And they finally decided, well, let's wait. Maybe after the pandemic has passed on, people will be more willing to sit down with the subject in literary terms. It turned out, I think there was no good time to sell a novel on a pandemic, before, during, or after a pandemic. Yeah.
Did you hear from any pandemic deniers?
No, I think fiction doesn't have enough cultural capital to attract deniers. The deniers are all worried about other stuff. So no, I didn't attract anybody like that.
Robert asks, recently heard that for historical fiction, the reader expects the facts to be true, but for the genre of memoir, the author can embellish. Do you agree or disagree? And what is your approach for writing in a historic place or time?
I think in historical fiction, the adjective is historical, the noun is fiction. So obviously you can make things up, but I do think you have a responsibility to the truth. And the kind of historical fiction that I respond to is fiction when I think, okay, this person really did their homework. This person knows that world. And usually what's going on is the world is as accurate as you can make it. What you're fictionalizing is the interiors of the various characters. As to the notion of memoir, you can embellish. Well, that's news to me. It's news to the relatives as well, I would think. I think everybody would agree that since memoir is an act of memory, it's inherently imperfect. But the idea that you're actively bullshitting or lying or something like that, I think is a problem in memoir. I think if you say, yeah, grandma was in the room, but I left her out because she wasn't very important, well, that's one thing. But if you say, my dad was an alcoholic and dad wasn't an alcoholic, and you call it a memoir, I think you got a problem.
You're in Williamstown, and I visited Williamstown during the pandemic, and it was so empty. Did you enjoy writing in that empty space, or did you miss the action of the town?
Toby Wolf once said, all he needs is a window to not write. So anything that will distract me is a bad idea when I'm writing. And I will, at any given moment, get up and start annoying my 3 beagles. And so the fact that it was empty, I was probably much better off. At one point, when I was writing my first novel, I was so easily distracted that I got so enraged with myself that I took a folding chair and put myself in a bathing suit and said, you're just going out in the middle of the field with a pad and you're not coming in until the day is over, essentially. That's how easily distracted I can get, I think.
Last question for you. Your work's often described as cutting edge. And as you mature as a writer, are you more or less cutting edge at this moment?
Well, I guess that depends on what you call cutting edge. If by cutting edge, you mean the latest cultural developments, I am on the ass end of that tail, let me tell you. My chances of writing the definitive thing about Facebook or Instagram are pitifully small, I think. I'm also not very interested for all of the historical and ranging around kind of fiction that I've done. I've never been very interested in writing about the future. Although Project X the most recent novel about the pandemic, Phase 6, was very much one of those, 6 months in the future kind of books. So I guess I would say I'd like to imagine that I'm cutting edge in some kind of stylistic or emotional way, but I'm probably not. I'm probably somewhere on the ass end of tradition there.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for reading the beginning of that wonderful story and answering, your great answers to the questions. And there is Phase 6 and many of Jim's books. So please check it out. If you are not a believer in Amazon, go to your local store, go to bookshop.org, and get a Jim Shepard book as soon as you can, especially before the holidays. So thank you again, Jim.
Thank you. Take care, Tim.
And for those that are watching the live stream on Facebook, you want to be part of the open mic, just click the link and I'll gladly let you in for that. And thank you for watching as well.
Bye-bye, everybody.